All right, so I want to welcome our guest speaker today. Why don't you go ahead and tell us what is your name and where are you from and what do you do for a living?
Yep. So my name is Matt Davis. I am from Kansas City, Kansas, in the United States. Right now, I am a content creator. So I have a YouTube channel. I am also, I do some freelance work as a writer. I am also a delivery driver, so I do a few different things to support myself. Um, yeah.
Right, so we're doing this for American Studies classes here in Norway. Under English, under that umbrella is American Studies, which what that entails is that they will study some of the geography, the history, social studies, and it's very important that you, as an American, can give us your point of view from a real person, not somebody from a book or somebody that wrote something and fabricated it for them to read. So, the very first question I want to ask you is about the American dream. What is
Mm.
the American dream to you, and do you think it's still achievable today?
Uh, to me, when I think of the American dream, I think of the idea that you can live in America or you can come to America. And if you work hard, you can make a life for yourself that is comfortable. It might not mean that you are very rich. It might not mean that you are the most famous and most successful person, but it's this idea that if you work hard, that you can live a comfortable life. Um, I do think as time has gone on, the American dream for a lot of people in different ways has become more complicated. Uh, in the United States, there's unfortunately um, a lot of prejudice that has been stirred up against immigrants. There is things like the rising cost of housing or gun violence or things like that that have um, sometimes made living in America difficult. Um, but at least I think it's this dream, it's this ideal that people have that America represents a place where there's opportunity with jobs and education.
Excellent. And the reason why I'm specifically asking this is that in both books that we teach, Citizens, and also a book named Interactions, in both books, there are sections of it where the American dream is discussed, and it's amazing how it is not just about the American dream for Americans, but also the people that come to America and want something and want that dream for themselves. That's probably the reason why people who cross the border in order to try for a better life, they're called dreamers. So
Mm,
that's part of it. The next thing I want to ask you about, let's talk about freedom of speech. What does
mm.
that mean to you? And do you feel like it is a real concept or is it very abstract? And once put into reality, it doesn't really work. What do you think about that in the United States specifically?
With the concept of freedom of speech, I think it means you can express an opinion about the government, or you can express your opinions about religion or about politics. And at least in theory, you won't have you won't go to jail for saying something publicly. And I think that's something that in America, people can be very defensive about if they feel like their freedom of speech is not protected. There's always a debate over, should things like hate speech be considered free speech? And I would be on the side of people that would say there's some forms of hate speech and harassment that should be more restricted. But uh, y- yeah, and so I mean, it's something that I think people define as a core American value that you can express yourself however you want. Um, I do think that in practice, sometimes things become a little more complicated, though.
It is a very interesting topic for discussion because what happens is how much freedom do we actually have, right?
Hmm.
What is what is under freedom of speech and what is when does it become harassment? So I agree with you on that. I would like to ask you, since it's February 2024 and we're celebrating Black History Month, I'd like to hear your opinions about it. Do you think it's a valid celebration for schools in America?
I do. I uh, I think so much of our history comes from a very specific perspective. There's things about the history of the United States and the history of the world, really, that um, I feel like I didn't learn as much of as I needed to in school. I think about so much of world history. Like when people say the term Middle Ages, I think of Europe. I don't think of what was going on everywhere else in the world. And so, I think it's really important to have Black History Month or, Indigenous Peoples Day that we have in the United States or things like that that really have a specific focus on a particular group's history. Because ideally, every month would be Black History Month. Every month would be Indigenous Peoples, History Month. But we don't always hear about that. So I think it's important to have that time.
So the next topic that I had in mind was I was talking about Pride Month last year with some of my students, and some people might have felt uncomfortable with that, and some people might have felt uncomfortable with Black History Month and International Women's History Month as well. What do you think would be the right approach to introduce Pride Month in schools? Should it be introduced or not? And what are your thoughts about it?
I I think Pride Month should be taught in schools. I think it's a part of our history, and no matter what your cultural or religious beliefs are concerning the LGBTQ community, you don't have to have the same views on gender or sexuality to acknowledge that this community is a part of our community and a part of our history. And um yeah, I mean, I think about when I think of Pride Month, I think of it in the United States. We had the Stonewall riots in the 1960s, and that was a really important part of our history at that time that really changed a lot of things with our culture. And there are LGBTQ people in, entertainment and in politics and in so many different fields. And I think it's important that needs to be acknowledged. But just because you acknowledge that, it's not like a challenge to anyone's beliefs. So, some people are going to be uncomfortable, but that's part of living in a world where there's different types of people.
Thank you for your input. I feel like there are a lot a lot of ways to celebrate every culture and everybody without interfering with how people identify or how they live their lives. That's very important.
Mm.
So now I want to ask you about the upcoming elections. What do you think will happen? And this is not like what you think will happen based on what you want to happen, but there could be two separate questions. What do you think will
Mm.
happen? And what would you like to happen with the upcoming elections in the United States?
I guess what I worry will happen is if, well, after our last presidential election in 2020, when Donald Trump lost, and by every measure of, um, you know, auditing or looking into the elections that we have, where court systems and people that investigate that looked at that, Donald Trump lost and Joe Biden won. Um, there was still a lot of people, because of misinformation on the internet, who felt like Donald Trump was, that the election was rigged against him, and they stormed the Capitol. And um, my fear is that if Donald Trump does not win again, that we will see something like that happen again. And even if that doesn't happen again, I think there will be a lot of people who um, it just feel like the election was rigged because that's what they're told to believe online. And so I guess my Uh, the thing I think will happen, unfortunately, is I think no matter how the election turns out, whether it's Joe Biden that wins, whether it's Donald Trump that wins, um, I think there will be a lot of people who distrust the election process. And, but what I would like to happen is that people come together. They accept, even if the election didn't turn out the way they wanted, they accept the results, and we move on as a country. And um, yeah, so I guess that's my main concern, is worrying about what elections look like in the future in the United States, and whether or not people will continue to trust the election results.
It's very important that you bring up the 6th of January. We were recently looking at that when the anniversary of that day happened.
Mm.
And some some of my students over the course of the many years I've been a teacher, some of them knew Donald Trump as the guy from The Apprentice. You're
Mhm.
fired. Yeah, and I remember back then just talking about reality TV and competition shows, just talking about television,
Mm.
teaching many, many years ago in Brazil and in Australia and different places. If somebody had told me he would have been the president now, I would have never believed it. That
Mhm.
he this is just I still sometimes don't believe that that even happened, but I see what you mean. And we have talked about the riots and what caused the riots. And but there are different points of view in this part of the world as well, where people actually do believe that he won those elections. So
Mhm.
it's I try to respect everyone's point of view
Mhm.
and then just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so one of the things that has been a constant whenever I talk about the United States and I praise the United States, I have a very special history with the US, having lived there as a child and then having gone back to finish high school. So I think of the United States fondly. But whenever I talk about the United States, there will be somebody that say, "Oh, I would never go there because I don't want to get shot." So people are
Mm.
under the impression because of the media and how events are portrayed, that people should be very afraid at all times, everywhere in the United States because of the gun situation. What is the gun situation where you are in your state, for example? Could you tell us a little bit about the rules and regulations, what you know about it?
Um, I will say it just for me at this specific time period, it's been a difficult time. I live in the Kansas City area, um, and we have our biggest sports event of the year, which is the Super Bowl. Sorry, and you know, it was this big event because our team won, and it should be this joyous occasion, and we had this big parade. I knew people that were there, um, and there was a shooting, and this was just recently, and this was at an area I've been to many different times, and it just to okay, so just trying to collect myself here. It just for there to be this big victory parade for our sports team winning the Super Bowl, and uh for this shooting to just break out randomly, and for people that were enjoying themselves to have to run for cover, and for children to be shot, and for um an innocent person to lose their life. It was really scary. And I'll be honest, like, I wish I could say that living in the United States, I don't have to think about gun violence, but I do. Every excuse me. Sorry. About you know, if someone with a gun did come into this crowded area and decide to shoot people, what would I do? Where would I go? So, you know, I wish I could say that the portrayal on the media was fake, or it was like some exaggeration, but I do think coming into the United States, unfortunately, it is a really scary part of our life, and it doesn't mean that everywhere you go necessarily you have to think about gun violence, but I think when there is a crowded event like that, it it's it's what I think about, and I think it's what a lot of people think about, and so um yeah. So anyway, so I'm just very emotional because this was something that was very personal and just very recent, that happened, and to see that happening and to know people that were there, it was it was scary.
I'm really sorry that that happened, and if it must feel very close to home for you because we see on television and we see mostly online whenever all of this is reported. It usually starts a discussion about gun control, who should have guns and who shouldn't, and what
Mhm.
type of regulations should there be, do you think?
Well, I think there should be more. um, I live in an area where a lot of people own guns, and there are um, very little restrictions on who can get a gun and where you can take a gun. So I live at on the border of two states, Kansas and Missouri, And in Missouri, in particular, um, there are laws that state that if you want to bring a gun into a hospital or into a school, you can do that. And I know to people in other countries that seems like really wild, but that that's how things are in the United States. And people obsess over guns. There are more guns in the United States than there are people, which is kind of wild when you think about that. Um, so I wish there was more restrictions on people owning a gun, getting access to a gun. I wish that some of the weapons, like assault weapons, were not legal. Um, I unfortunately don't really think that people are going to ever give up those guns, though. I think that's just kind of where we're at.
I have interviewed people from the US who feel the exact opposite, who feel that
Hmm.
everyone should have a gun to defend themselves. I interviewed a lady who had some concealed carry, and we were trying to explain that to my Norwegian students what that
Hmm.
entailed. So it is a very different reality from what we have here. Most people who have guns here are hunters. They're very
Hmm.
big on hunting here for food. But it is something that we have to wait and see what the future will bring, because there are so many amazing aspects of the United States that I still feel that there is a brighter future ahead if certain things can change. But
Hmm.
but again, see, my name is Pollyanna, so I'm so optimistic. I try to live up to my name. But
Yeah.
yes. So just to finalize, I want to ask you if you have to say something that screams United States for you. Like, what would you like people to think whenever we say America? What would
Mhm.
you like people to relate to that? If you could put something out there that maybe people don't think about.
Um, hmm. What to me screams America? You know, I guess recently with the Super Bowl, even though unfortunately there was that event at the parade, which kind of, put a cloud over things. I do think the event of everyone, it's really the one time in um, it is still in the United States where everyone watches the same thing on TV at the same time. People get together and they have parties, and there's that um, there's that culture of people coming together, and whether they are into sports or not into sports, or they want to watch the Super Bowl halftime show, or they're just a fan of Taylor Swift or whatever. um, that kind of, you know, I mean, I guess that's kind of one of the biggest things I think about when I think of the culture of the US is like the pop culture and movies and television and that sort of thing. And I think people in the US really take it for granted. I mean, like in the US we watch some shows from other countries, but I think what always amazes me is just how much American pop culture like permeates everywhere else. And so anyway, yeah, I mean, media is definitely something I take a huge interest in. That's what I talk about on my YouTube channel. And um, yeah, I guess that's kind of I guess, quintessential thing in America for me is the pop culture and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Whenever, and this is an interesting aspect of language, because when people say football here in Europe, And
Hmm.
also in Australia and New Zealand, in Brazil, other places where I have lived, they think of soccer. But then when they talk about football, what you call football, even when we translate into Portuguese, futebol americano, and so
Hmm.
they call it American football. So it is something, it is American. It is what represents American on many levels. So yes, absolutely. Thank you so very much for all your help with this. I think it's very important for the students to have access to what is really going on in the US and not just what somebody else was told to say. And with books and audio files from books, they have a very scripted version of English and how people speak and how they express themselves. So this is why this here is so important. So I want to thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thanks for speaking with me, Pollyanna. So, yeah, all the students, thanks for listening to me too. So,
All right. So I'll stay in touch with
I
you
can't
and
hear
give
you.
you feedback. How about now?
I still can't hear.
How about now?
I'm not sure what happened. Sounds like the audio cut out. Maybe we
Let's
could.
see. Let me